Well, hello. My name's Adrian Gilbert, and if you don't know me, I'm mostly an author of ancient mysteries and researching into sort of lost knowledge and forgotten wisdom. Uh, Probably best known for the book I wrote with Robert Bovell a long time ago now, back in the 1990s, The Orion Mystery, which was a research into the pyramids of Egypt and how they were connected with the stars of Orion's belt. And you can see it summarized pretty clearly with these two pictures here, one of the pyramids from an overhead shot and the other of the stars of Orion's belt. And you may have seen recently there's been a new discovery made of a piece of wood that was found in the pyramids by a guy called Wayman Dixon in 1872. Well, my co-author Robert Bovell did a lot of research on that, and I was with him. We went to the British Museum and researching this, and they at first claimed they didn't know anything about it, but eventually they came up and they showed us this little hook affair here and this ball. But there was a third piece, a piece of wood, which had disappeared, and we assumed it was totally lost to history. That's now been found in Aberdeen, in the University of Aberdeen of all places. It's been carbon dated, and it's revolutionary about the dating of the pyramids. Anyway, yeah. Today I'm going to talk to you about something rather different, which was an investigation through symbols and symbolism concerning the whole subject of Brexit. Now you might think, well, that's got nothing to do with ancient mysteries. Well, it has in a big way, and it's also what you might call a modern mystery. And what I'm going to show you by investigating these symbols is how it was inevitable that Britain at some point was going to leave the European Union. And the symbols actually tell us that. So we have the situation now that the United Kingdom is leaving the European Union. It's as though one of those stars is being pulled out, and it's the British star. And on the 1st of January, actually we've already officially left the European Union at the end of last January in 2020. But there's been a sort of interim period while things have gone on as normal, and while they've been negotiating what they call a deal, a new trading deal. And so far, and I'm talking now, I think it's the 20th of December, they haven't come up with a deal that both sides can agree. So it should be that at the end of this month, 31st of December, we've fully left. And it looks like it's going to be no deal, but that could change, who knows. But anyway, I'm going to look at the symbols, including these flags, and how they tell us a story, and a story of incompatibility that was certain at some point to lead to divorce. Now, in this lecture, I'm going to be investigating, through symbolism, the relationship between the United Kingdom and the European Union, and how this was always going to end in divorce. You may say, well, how do you know that? Well, when you investigate symbols, symbols are actually connected with the collective unconscious. And the symbols selected by a nation, what you might call the mythology on which it's based, and the way it identifies itself, is very often expressed in symbols which become public property. An obvious example of this is the flag of a nation. But there are other symbols too, which tell us a story, and it's often a story which is quite at odds with the story that's been generally narrated. So we're starting off today with the EU and Brexit, an investigation through symbols by myself, Adrian Gilbert. Now, the EU, or European Union, is one of the most influential bodies in the world today. It began life with the Treaty of Rome in 1956. This was signed by 6 countries: France, Western Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium and Luxembourg. Those last 3 are generally summarised as Benelux countries. Together, these countries formed the European Economic Community. This was essentially a trading bloc where coal, steel, agriculture and fisheries were harmonised. The nations controlled imports so that they helped each other by trading more with one another. The expressed intention was noble. The numerous wars, especially those between France and Germany, had damaged European civilization and made the continent weaker. It was intended to put an end to these conflicts through peaceful means. In other words, by sharing things and trading together and having this European economic community, they would harmonise things and that they wouldn't have these damaging wars. You know, we had two great world wars in the first half of the 20th century. And there was the Franco-Prussian War in the 1870s. And these are very, very harmful to the continent as a whole. So the idea was, let's put everything aside, put our differences aside and work together. We're all Europeans after all. We have the same ideals, maybe we speak different languages, but underneath that, the civilization is basically a Christian civilization. And let's just put aside our differences and work together. And that was the noble enterprise. Now, in 1973, Britain, Ireland and Denmark joined the EEC, it's the European Economic Community. At the same time, Greenland and the Faroe Islands also joined, but they later withdrew. Greece joined in 1981, with Spain and Portugal coming on board in 1986. In 1995, there was a further enlargement with Sweden, Finland and Austria. Shortly afterwards, in 1992, the Maastricht Treaty was signed. It came into force in 1993, bringing about the first stages of full-on political union. The name was changed to the EU, European Union. A new flag with 12 stars was adopted, along with an anthem. And there was to be a European Parliament, free movement of people between countries with rights to work and gain benefits in the countries that they moved to. Several further extensions took place to bring in Eastern Europe. The total number of countries rose to 28, so we've gone from 6 to 28. Now I want us to look at some symbols and see what these are really telling us, which isn't necessarily what we're told. And the first symbol I want us to look at is the curious statue. There's more than one of these, where you have this young woman riding on the back of a bull. I know it's a very futuristic image, this one, but there are others which are kind of more logical and normal, you might say. And what's this about? Well, the story of Europa is about, it's a Greek myth, and the story goes that there was this young girl who looked after cattle for her father. And they lived in Phoenicia, which is modern-day Lebanon. And the god Zeus, the Greek version of Jupiter, looked down and he saw this young woman. He really fancied her. Now, Zeus was a bit of a lad where it came to the girls, and he had numerous affairs in Greek mythology. And he really fancied this girl. So he decided the way to get close to her was to turn himself into a white bull, which he did. And then she noticed this white bull, and at first was a bit scared of it, but it seemed very tame and kind and calm. And gradually she got over her fears. She came up and stroked it, and the bull didn't sort of do anything. It was very, very peaceable. So she thought, well, this is all right. And she got up on its back. And at that point, the bull suddenly decided to race off, and he raced into the sea, the girl hanging on for dear life. And the bull swam away from the Lebanese coast all the way to Crete, which is a large island to the south of Greece. And there he made her his mistress, and she gave birth to 3 sons, one of whom was Minos, the famous King Minos of Crete. Anyway, the story of Europa is one of abduction and rape. And so you wonder, why on earth would the European Union want to put a statue outside its headquarters celebrating the abduction and rape of this girl taken from Lebanon? And it's not as though this is a sole example of this. This is another statue of the same thing, which is outside the Parliament building in Strasbourg. And I believe there are other ones too. It's obviously a theme which the European Union kind of like. they kind of celebrated. Now I know the word Europa, Europe, kind of conjures up the idea of European civilization. But you wonder why they want to look at European civilization through the eyes and the perceptions of the abduction of Europa. And I think I know the answer to this now. It's all to do with this concept of tricking the girl into thinking the bull wasn't going to do anything. It was, it was gentle, it was kind, it was calm, it was tame. It was quite safe for her to get up on its back. And that's exactly what's happened with Europe, with the EEC. In the early days, back in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, it was a trading bloc. And yes, there were rules about trade. There were tariffs that were protecting the European market from other people in the rest of the world. But by and large, it was intended as a trading bloc. And that kind of lulled people in Europe into a false sense of security, and more countries got on board. And then we had the Maastricht Treaty, and suddenly everything changed. Suddenly what had been this trading bloc became, in effect, what was going to become a new country in its own right. It wanted to become a United States of Europe, or actually more like a Soviet Union, a European Soviet Union, with more and more laws, less and less rights for the citizens, and more control, and the sort of ending of democracy within those countries. Still, yes, there's European Parliament, but that's just a rubber stamp. The real power would be with the Commission that's appointed. And so it's a technocratic country in the making. And I think that's why they secretly put these bull and Europa statues around the place, almost chuckling to themselves at how they're duped the countries of Europe. Now I want to take us to another image here. This is actually the Parliament building in Strasbourg in France. Now this is the main Parliament building, although there's another one in Brussels which is used more. This one was the original Parliament building, and under the treaties, France had the right to host the Parliament. And so they're not going to give up that right. So this building is still kept and maintained. And every month there was a whole parade. All the people, all the parliamentarians in Brussels get into a fleet of cars and taxis and coaches, and loads of trunks full of papers and documents are taken to the Parliament building in Strasbourg, and they have a debate there for a few days, and then they pack everything up and move back to Brussels. It's a real pantomime. But what I want you to look at here is look at the building itself, and you look at it and you think, well, it's incomplete. Why have they not finished it off? Well, it is finished off. It's just that this is what they intended it to look like. And the reason it looks like this is it's meant to represent this, the Tower of Babel by Peter Bruegel, that's a painter. You know the story of the Tower of Babel. This is in the Bible, in the book of Genesis, after the story of Noah and his ark and the great flood. Shortly after, sometime afterwards, there was enough people. They gathered at this place Babel, which means gateway of God, and they decided that they were going to build a tower to take them up to heaven. So they started their building process, and God in heaven, looking down with his archangels, thought, well, we don't really want this, they're coming up here and they're not fit. So to stop them doing this, God made it so that they couldn't understand each other, and created a whole babel of languages. So the people found they couldn't communicate properly, the bricklayers with the carpenters, with the plumbers, with the whoever, and so they gave up, and then they dispersed and went to different places populating the entire world, the entire planet. And that's the story in the Bible of the Tower of Babel. So you have to ask yourself, why on earth is the European Union harking back to the Tower of Babel? Well, we see this within a poster which they themselves published, and here you can see it. You can see very clearly here how this poster is harking back to that very picture I showed you just now, Peter Bruegel's Tower of Babel. And it says here, Europe, many tongues, one voice. In other words, this project is supposedly going to bring together the nations with all their different languages and give them one voice. They're going to get on with building this tower, that they're going to complete the mission, as it were, of the people who had been stopped by God in the Bible from building their tower to take them to heaven. You might think, well, that's all well and good. What's the problem with that? Well, I want you to look at these stars. Now, you would have seen that flag of the European Union with the 12 stars shown you earlier. Here you can see the stars laid out around the tower. And you can see very clearly from this picture that the blue colour in the background is intended to represent the sky. And that's the same on the flag, it's sky blue. And the stars, there's 12 of them. And when you see 12 things, stars related to the sky, you immediately have to think of the signs of the zodiac, the 12 signs of the zodiac, and how those are arranged in a circuit. And that circuit goes around, and it goes around and Babel is the original name for Babylon. Babylon's a famous city in what's now Iraq, was called Mesopotamia, between the two rivers, between Potamia rivers. So between the two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, we call them in English, was this country known as Mesopotamia, and Babylon was major city, the major city in there. But there's other things to do with Babel and Babylon which are talked about in the Bible. And in fact, there's two cities that are talked about most in the Bible. One is Jerusalem, obviously, Jerusalem, the capital of Israel and of Judah, and the other is Babylon. And you find these as two diametrically opposed powers or cities. The one is the heavenly city of Jerusalem, where the Messiah is to come, the sort of godly city. And the other is this sort of city of Babylon, which represents everything to do with materialism and trade and earthliness. But we'll come to that as we go on, as we progress. Now, in 586 BC, the country of Judah, which is the land of the Jews, the Judeans or Jews, their capital was Jerusalem, and they were conquered by the Babylonians, King Nebuchadnezzar. And the Babylonians took the city, they looted it, they robbed the temple, the famous Temple of Solomon, and took the treasures back to Babylon, and took the people captive, or most of them, back to Babylon to be servants and slaves. So we have this other situation, besides the Tower of Babel. We have the story of Babylon in the Bible as the sort of slave mastering nation that took over. And while they were in Babylon, the king Nebuchadnezzar had a dream, and he couldn't remember his dream. He asked his astrologers and the wise men to interpret the dream. They said, well, sure, we'll do that for you. What was it? He said, I can't remember, which is a bit of a problem. But then Daniel, who was one of the Jewish people who had been taken there, volunteered, and he said, I think I can interpret your dream, and let me ask God to show me. So he asked God, and God sent him the dream, and he was then able to interpret Nebuchadnezzar's dream, that he had seen the image of a big statue, and it had a golden head, which represented the Babylonian Empire from Nebuchadnezzar and his immediate successors. But this would be overthrown and followed by a silver empire represented by the chest and the arms, which was the Medo-Persian Empire. And in fact that did happen in 539, I think it was, when the Medo-Persians conquered Babylon. But they would be overthrown, by a Bronze Empire, and that indeed happened when Alexander the Great led his great invasion of the Persian Empire, and he took that over in 330 BC. But that, in its turn, would be overthrown, and there would be the Empire of Iron, which was represented by the two legs, and that's the Roman Empire, which overthrew the Greek. Or I should say that the Greek Empire had already split up into smaller parts, but it was still the Greek nation, the Greek Empire, still the same Greek civilization, and that was overthrown by the Romans. Two legs, because the Roman Empire split into two. You had a Western Empire and an Eastern Empire with two capitals, Rome and Constantinople. So that's why you had that. And then the fall of the Roman Empire would lead to successor states represented by the feet and toes. And those would be what would come after the Roman Empire. And those would be a mixture of iron and clay. So they'd have some of the strength of the old Roman Empire, but also be quite fragile and brittle, like crockery. So that was the dream of Nebuchadnezzar, which was interpreted by the prophet Daniel. And then again, we see in the book of Revelation, we see talk about Babylon and the scarlet whore of Babylon. There you can see her holding her cup of drunkenness, and she's riding on the back of a seven-headed dragon. Now that seven-headed dragon represents the seven successor kingdoms or empires, which are manifestations of the power of Satan. Satan is the devil, is the dragon, right, that she's riding on the back of, and she represents this alluring, tempting temptress who lures mankind to destruction through these pagan empires, one after another. Now, the flag of the European Union, as I said, is these 12 stars, and it seems to be trying to resurrect the ancient civilization, or the series of civilizations culminating in the Roman Empire. It wants to be a new Roman Empire. That is its mission. And when we look at these 12 stars, I want to show you something here that makes this quite clear, that there is something very dark, something you might even call it satanic, about what is being done here with this plan, the abduction of Europa by the bull, the celebration of the Tower of Babel, and these 12 stars. And as I said, the 12 stars represent the EU flag, and they're centered on an axis that rises from the center of the Tower of Babel. In other words, there is a circlet of stars rotating around a central axis. And we can think of those 12 stars as representing the 12 signs of the zodiac. I think that's a reasonable thing to say. And they go round and round, but they don't go round and round our North Pole. They go round a different pole, which we call the pole of the ecliptic. And I'll come to that in a minute. But also notice that these stars are downward pointing pentagrams, which is itself a symbol associated with Satanism. So we're beginning to see that there is something quite dark, or maybe sinister, about the European Union. Now, before you start saying, Adrian, you're just inventing this, European Union is just a political thing like United States or United Arab Emirates or something, it's just yes, okay, they have some idea about some kind of unified structure in Europe, but isn't that a good thing? Well, I want you to look more carefully at these symbols that they adopt, because the symbols tell us the story that is not put into words, yet it has to reveal itself. So when we look at the situation of this pivot with the stars going around it, it does mean something. And I want to show you what that is, or at least what I think it is. Now here you can see the 12 signs of the zodiac, and I'm sure you're all familiar with that. I'm pretty sure that everyone watching this knows very well what their own sign is. We all have one. And they represent where the sun is at different times of year. The sun appears to us on Earth to go through, to follow a pathway through the sky. And we see different stars behind it. Well, actually, we don't see them. What we see is what's not, what we can see is not what's behind it because it's too bright. But we know that it goes through and it goes to, Aries, Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, Leo, and so on, all the way around and comes back again. We know that. Now, of course, it's not real. I mean, the sun is not going round us. Actually, what's happening is the Earth is going round the sun. We've known that since the time of Copernicus. And there is actually an axis, which is the axis of the ecliptic, as it's called. You can imagine this circuit going round has a point of origin. There's a pole which points towards it, and it's not the North Pole, because the Earth is tipped over by 23.5 degrees, right? So that's part of it. But also the Earth is doing this, and it's rocking around. So we have where our North Pole is pointing is the North Star, obviously, but that changes over time through something called the precession of the equinox. And I'm not going to go into that in depth, except to say that there's you can imagine the Earth has a slight wobbly motion. At least that's how we picture it. And because of that wobbly motion, the place where the North Pole is pointing describes a circuit. It goes round. And at the time of ancient Egypt, it was pointing at a star called Thuban, which was in the constellation of Draco. And it carried on moving, and now it points at Polaris. And it will carry on moving and it will go through the constellation of Cepheus. It doesn't always point at a specific star. Most of the time it's pointing at a sort of empty space. You just have to work out where that is. And it'll come around to the star Deneb in Lyra. So, no, it's not Deneb. Anyway, in the constellation of Lyra. So it's describing a circuit going round, and the centre of that circle is what's called the pole of the ecliptic. And I think I can show that best to you on a sky globe, and I have one here. Now what I want you to see here, can you see all these yellow dots coming round? That is the ecliptic, and you can see that they go round. This is the northern hemisphere. It's the equivalent of the Earth's northern hemisphere, but it's in the sky. And then there's a southern hemisphere, and this circle described by all these dots, it has its own North Pole, which is not the same as this is the North Pole of the Earth, what it's turning around, the axis of the Earth, equivalent in the sky. But the North Pole of the ecliptic is a separate point, and it's somewhere around here. Yeah, and in fact it's 23.5 degrees separate from the actual North Pole. I'm going to show you here if I can on the slides. So here you can see that circle is the movement of the North Pole because of the precession of the equinox. That's what gives us the age of Aquarius and all of that. The equinox is moving back through different signs of the zodiac. But this is what you see at the north, and it currently is pointing at the North Star Polaris, and it used to point in the Egyptian times at Thuban. And notice there is the pole of the ecliptic in the middle of that circle. But where is that point? Well, it's actually in the constellation of Draco, the dragon. The fixed point around which the North Pole moves in a circle is in the constellation of Draco, the dragon. Symbolically, the dragon is curled around this axis. Now, this is very important, symbolically speaking, because you can think of that axis as being like the trunk of a tree. And imagine the trunk of a tree and there's a serpent curled around the top of it. And that is your tree of knowledge of good and evil. Take that, just hold that in your mind just for a moment. So think about, if we look at this slide here, you can see the dragon draped around the position of the pole of the ecliptic. It's controlling the pole of the ecliptic, which is what the 12 signs of the zodiac do. So that is actually the pivoting point around which these 12 stars of the European Union are rotating. And then think to the story of Adam and Eve. There you see a trunk of a tree with a serpent and the apple. The apple represents the planet Earth. And the eating of the apple symbolizes coming into physicality, into three-dimensional existence on planet Earth. And when you do that, yes, you have the chance to explore the nature of physicality and through having a living body, but you're also going to experience death. So that's why it says in the book of Genesis that once they'd eaten the apple, that's when death came into the world, that they were then going to die. For that, they're immortal souls. They weren't physical. But now they were going to be physical. They were going to die. And they would have the experience of learning through knowledge. Right? And the devil, who's symbolized by the serpent there, tempts them and says, look, you'll know as much as God. You'll have all knowledge. You'll progress, and he doesn't want that. So eat the apple and you won't regret it. Well, they eat the apple and then they find themselves cut off from being able to talk to God directly. In other words, they can no longer communicate with the intelligence of the universe as it is of itself. They have to explore things by doing things like experiments, what we now call science. And so this is a very different situation to find ourselves in. And they're under the control of this serpent being that we can call Satan. Now, I want to look again at the symbolism relating both to Britain and to the EU. We've looked at some of the symbolism to do with the EU. It sees itself as abducting Europa as the white bull. It sees itself as reviving the Roman Empire, which is a successor state to Babylon, hence the Tower of Babel. And it's connected with this whole idea of the pivot of the axis round which the zodiac rotates, the pole of the ecliptic, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So it's all linked up with this kind of Satanism, although you're not told that. Now, I want you to look at this and how this contrasts with the situation in Britain. Now, this is the flag of the United Kingdom. I'm sure everybody listening to this knows this. They will recognise it. It's one of the most instantly recognisable flags on the planet. And it's a great design. But it's actually made out of 3 individual flags melded together. There's a central cross, that red cross, on a white background, which is the flag of England, flag of St. George. And there's a red cross, a sort of X-shaped cross on a white background, which is the flag of St. Patrick of Ireland. And then there's a white cross on a blue background, which is the flag of St. Andrew in Scotland. So you have the flags of Scotland, Ireland, which of course these days means just Northern Ireland, because Southern Ireland seceded from the Union a long time ago, 100 years ago now, and England. And why Wales is not represented on here is because it's included with England, because it's a principality included within the Kingdom of England, although it does have its own flag as well. Now, I want us to look here primarily at the flag of St. George, because England is far and away the largest and most populated part of the United Kingdom. I think the population of the United Kingdom is something like 70 million, and 60 million of those live in England. So it gives you some idea of the scale. 6/7 is actually England, and only 1/7 is Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. So the dominant part is England, and its flag is the flag of St. George, this red cross on a white background. And I'm going to show you what that flag is really all about and what it symbolises. Now, in case you don't know or you've forgotten, St. George, he was a Roman soldier originally who converted to Christianity, lived in what we now call Turkey, Anatolia, and he was living at the time of Diocletian, the Roman Emperor Diocletian, who I think it was in 302 AD, started persecuting Christians, including George. And he was arrested and put on the rack and tortured, that he should give up his faith and worship the emperor as a god. This was always a problem with the Romans. They didn't mind you having other gods as long as you worshipped the emperor as a god. And he wouldn't do that because he was a Christian, and he was being taught that you mustn't worship false gods. So he was martyred, put to death for the faith. So he's a Christian martyr. Now, at this point, we're not talking about dragons, but his flag is the red cross on a white background. Now, that flag actually comes from the flag of Jesus Christ himself. If you look at icons of the resurrection, that symbolises Jesus coming out of his tomb, holding aloft a banner with the red cross on a white background. That's his banner of victory. And the red represents his blood, and the white his purity of spirit. So he's the perfect sacrifice, sacrificing his own blood for the redemption of mankind. And that's his banner of victory that he's holding aloft there. And you see it again here. This symbol here is what's called the Agnus Dei, the Lamb of God. And the Lamb of God, again, has this banner. This is the primary symbol of Easter, and it's the Lamb sacrificed for the sins of the world. And because of his victory over death and his resurrection, he's worthy to open the 7 seals in the book of Revelation. And you see those seals dangling there below. That's a reference to the book of Revelation, if you ever read that book, where the Lamb, representing Jesus Christ, is the only one in heaven worthy to open the seals because of what he's done, of his victory. So this flag of St. George represents redemption and the victory, and the victory of the Lamb of Jesus Christ over sin and Satan. So where does the dragon come in? Well, here we have St. George. There you can see he's got his shield, or I think actually it's his tabard that he's wearing there with his red cross on the white background, and he's driving a lance into the dragon and saving the damsel in distress in this image. But this is not meant to be understood literally. It's not that St. George encountered somehow a dinosaur which hadn't died out, or maybe it was really a crocodile that he killed. No, it's nothing to do with that. The dragon is Satan, and he's slaying the dragon by invocation of the victory of Jesus Christ over the dragon, over Satan, through the crucifixion, the resurrection and the ascension. And because George is true to his faith, he is able to overcome the dragon too. So that's what this is actually symbolizing. It's actually a symbol to do with faith, and the faith of the man who, to the point of martyrdom, will take on and defeat Satan in the name of Jesus Christ. So the banner of the cross, the red cross on the white background, becomes the rallying banner of those soldiers of Christ. And of course you see it with the Knights Templars later on. But in Britain it has a special meaning too, connected with our most highly thought of order, which is the order of the Garter, which goes back to 1347 and King Edward III. And he founded a new order which was intended to be a resurrection itself, or a recreation of the Knights of the Round Table of King Arthur. He was very much taken with the story of King Arthur, as were many people at that time. So he decided he was going to start his own order. They built a round tower in Windsor Castle to represent the Round Table, and his knights were to wear the insignia of the order, which is a garter, which they would wear usually around their knee, I think, or it might have been around their arm, which had written on it "Honi soit qui mal y pense," shame be on he who thinks evil. And now you can see the Queen. She's the head of the order, and she's got this big star with the cross of St. George in the middle of it, and the garter inside that star, because she is the connecting point, as it were, for the order. The other knights, they have the garter, and there you can see the cross. And you notice these chains that they have round their necks. That's called the collar of the order, and it's composed of roses. And we'll look at that in more detail shortly. And they meet together once a year. What you saw here is the procession of the Garter Knights. They have a procession in Windsor. Windsor is where the Queen lives primarily. You think about Buckingham Palace in London, but that's her London residence. Her main residence is Windsor Castle, and Windsor is to the west of London, further upstream along the River Thames. It's where Eton College is, by the way. So there's the Queen, and she's leading the procession, and they go to St. George's Chapel, which is in Windsor Castle, and you see those banners or flags hanging up. They're hanging over the stalls of the knights, and each knight has his own stall, and there's only ever to be 24 knights, plus the Sovereign and the Prince of Wales, and I think there might be other members of the royal family these days, but originally just 24 knights plus the Sovereign and the Prince of Wales made up the order, 26 in all, and the knights would have their stalls, and the number was kept to that, and you couldn't join the order until someone else had died, and then they would invite someone they felt was worthy to come and join. Now originally this was a fighting order. It wasn't just a ceremonial thing. These were the best knights in the nation, and to be installed there was a special ceremony where the knight is going to Windsor, I think probably on the same day, but I'm not sure, and he sits on his stall for the first time, and they put his arms up, meaning his flag. So this is a very big deal in England. It's a very big deal that, to become a member of the Order of the Garter is probably, for an Englishman, Englishwoman, and Margaret Thatcher, for instance, was a member of the order. Quite a few prime ministers have been Garter Knights as well. But for an Englishman to be invited to join the Order of the Garter is probably the biggest honour you can be given, and it's in the Sovereign decides. So, Queen Elizabeth today, she will appoint probably most, if not all, I would think, of the present Garter Knights. But each sovereign will appoint ones as when people die, and then there's new ones have to be raised. Winston Churchill, for instance, was a Garter Knight. Now here we have a look here more closely. There you can see the collar of the Garter Knights, and you can see there's Tudor roses joined together by this sort of everlasting knot, and each Tudor rose represents a different knight, and they're joined together in brotherhood as the sovereign's personal knights of his kind of round table, with the emblem of the Garter, Honi soit qui mal y pense, around the roses, Tudor roses there. And hanging from it is this emblem or jewel, which is known as the Great George. And it's a little jewel of George slaying the dragon, sitting on his horse slaying the dragon. So that again, St. George is the patron saint of the order. That's why, the flag of St. George is part of it. The emblematic, St. George is the patron saint of England, as well as the Order of the Garter. So they're trying to live up to the example of St. George, who's true to Christ, true to his faith, to death. He's ready to lay his life down, if needs be, in defence of that. And you have here, on the right-hand side here, a brooch, which is called a Little George, and in less formal occasions, they only wear the garter, the collar, when they're wearing the full robes, but on less formal occasions they'll wear the brooch. Huge honour again to be allowed to wear the brooch of the Order of the Garter, and that's called the Little George. So this is a really big deal in England, and it's to do with the national soul, the national spirit of England. But there's more as well. What you're looking at here on the left, you look at this wooden chair and you think, well, yeah, that's pretty old and, an antique, isn't it? Well, that is actually the coronation seat. And all the kings and queens of England, nearly all of them, have been crowned while sitting on that chair. And it's known as the chair of St. Edward, Edward the Confessor being the last of the Saxon kings, and he was buried in a shrine in Westminster Abbey. Because he had healing powers. People used to, the healing touch of the king. He had recorded healings, and people would go to his shrine to ask the saint for intercession to deal with their complaints, particularly skin complaints, I believe. Well, when he died in 1066, that's what prompted the whole invasion of England by the Normans. And the Norman kings rested their claim. Edward had promised that it would go to the successor would be William the Conqueror. So that's why we have the throne of Edward, but it's actually that was made at the time of Edward I, rather later, in 1296. And he had that special chair made so that they could put this block of stone in it. Now that block of stone is what's called the Stone of Scone, or Leofeil. And it has all sorts of other names to it. It's known as the Pharaoh's Stone, and it's also known as the pillow of Jacob, Jacob's pillow, or pillar stone, that in the Bible Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel, he's one of the patriarchs, and he's the father of the 12 sons who become the 12 tribes of Israel. And he laid his head on this stone, so they say, and he had a dream of a ladder going up to heaven and angels going up and down it. Now, you've got to understand that is now in the sort of rival to this Tower of Babel. They were trying to build a tower themselves to take themselves up to heaven. Here is a ladder, or a stairway to heaven, but it's a sacred stairway with angels going up and down it that Jacob sees, and he talks to God. So through Jacob is going to be established this connection with heaven that would not be allowed through the Tower of Babel, because that was a materialistic approach. So again, we have this, contradiction between the narratives to do with Britain and to do with the European Union. Now here we can see the Queen herself sitting on that chair at the time of her coronation, and she has to take an oath. Now I'm going to read you out what she has to take the oath to. So the Archbishop, that's the Archbishop of Canterbury, he's the most senior cleric in England. He's the sort of Pope of the Church of England. So he says, "Will you, to the utmost of your power, maintain the laws of God and the true profession of the gospel? Will you, to the utmost of your power, maintain in the United Kingdom the Protestant Reformed religion established by law? Will you maintain and preserve inviolably the settlement of the Church of England, and the doctrine, worship, discipline, and government thereof, as by law established in England. And will you preserve unto the bishops and clergy of England, and to the churches there committed to their charge, all such rights and privileges as by law do or shall appertain to them or any of them? And the Queen at the end of that says, all this I promise to do. So she's taken an oath, and it's an oath to God that she's going to maintain the law, she's going to maintain the church, she's going to preserve everything, the structure of the establishment church. She's said that. She's sworn an oath. And then we have the Queen swearing her coronation oath on the Bible. For this, she has to kneel down. And the Queen arises out of her chair, supported as before, the sword of state being carried before her. That's a big sword that they carried before the monarch. Being carried before her, shall go to the altar and make her solemn oath in the sight of all the people to observe the premises, laying her right hand upon the Holy Gospel in the great Bible, which was before carried in the procession, and is now brought from the altar by the Archbishop, and tendered to her as she kneels upon the steps, and saying these words, the things which I have here before promised, I will perform and keep, so help me God. Then the Queen shall kiss the book and sign the oath. So this is actually not just an empty ceremony. She's swearing an oath, and she's doing it in church at the altar steps, and also in front of the tomb of St. Edward the Confessor. So the symbolism is that St. Edward the Confessor, his soul is there by his tomb. He is bearing witness to her. She is swearing the oath in front of God that she's going to do all the things that she said she will. She's going to be a good queen, in other words. But it goes even further than this. Now, this is the imperial state crown, and this is the very crown that the Queen wore when she was being crowned in Westminster Abbey. And she's crowned by the Archbishop of Canterbury, and it's encrusted with thousands of diamonds, pearls, and other very costly gems, and it's deeply symbolic. The closed loop of the cross indicate that the monarch of Great Britain is fully sovereign and not beholden to other crowns. That's those bands you see going around the top, forming a cross at the top, a sort of flat cross over the velvet. That shows that she is fully sovereign. She's not beholden to anyone else. She hasn't got an emperor standing over her, that her kingdom is dependent upon the good wishes and goodwill of the emperor. She's not like an earl. I mean, there are other people in Britain who wear crowns. The Queen is not the only person to wear a crown. So the cross pate on top represents the authority of Jesus Christ as ruler or king over the earth, the kingdom of heaven on earth, which is what Christians believe, that thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, that Jesus Christ is king and he's coming back. So the Queen is like a sort of regent to him, that he's coming back, and one day he is going to be the one sitting on the throne of David, which is symbolized by that stone, the stone of destiny, in the New Jerusalem. So this is a very, very big deal in England. And I don't know if many people realize this, even in Britain. And you notice there are other cross pates. There's one on the front there with that big ruby in the middle of it. And there are four of these facing the four cardinal directions, north, south, east and west. And it shows that the authority of Jesus Christ extends over the whole earth and is in opposition to the authority of the dragon, the devil, who has his kingdom on earth, which is the Babylonian succession. So there is this diametrically opposed thing going on. Now, I want us to look at the national anthem of Britain. Now, you've all heard it before, I'm sure, but you know how it goes. God save our gracious Queen, long live our noble Queen, God save the Queen. Send her victorious, happy and glorious, long to reign over us, God save the Queen. So that's the national anthem. But I want you to notice here something, that this anthem is not just celebrating, oh, we're so wonderful and our land is so beautiful, it's green and lush and, typical national anthem. This is actually a prayer. This anthem is a prayer. You look at those words, it's a prayer, and it starts off with the word God. So the British are praying to God every time they say their national anthem. And it used to be when I was a boy that if you ever heard the national anthem playing, as they used to play it at the end of, the television when the BBC One, it was just BBC in those days, was closing down for the night, they would play the national anthem and everyone would stand up. And in cinemas, after the end of the films, whatever they've been showing, they would play the national anthem and everyone would stand up. And that's because it is this prayer. So I want you to see that there is this whole thing. Maybe it's not. Maybe other nations do this too. I don't know. But certainly in England, and I think in the rest of Britain, we all use the national anthem. That we're not just praying to the Queen because she's such a lovely person and we want her to live forever. It's actually because she wears the crown, and the crown is the crown of the kingdom of heaven on earth. That's what we're praying to, and that's why we ask her to be preserved. Now, another thing in England that's a big deal, and you'll find this in the end of the book of Revelation. There's the last but one chapter. It talks about the New Jerusalem that comes down from heaven, and it has 12 gates, one for each tribe of Israel. Have a look in the book of Revelation. It's the last book in the Bible, and I think this is chapter 21. And it tells about this city of New Jerusalem coming out of heaven, and it's a sort of renewal image. Well, in Britain, we have this concept that Britain is the new Israel. I know there's, you think of that, you think, oh my God, what stage are you talking about? Israel is in Palestine. We all know where Israel is. Six-Day War and all of that. We know all about Israel. Well, I want you to understand that even centuries ago, long before this modern state of Israel and Palestine was founded, the British had this belief that they're descended from the lost tribes of Israel. Well, who are they? Well, you're familiar with the Jews, and we talk about the Jews and we talk about Israel interchangeably, but that's actually not right. There were 12 tribes of Israel. And at the time of King David and King Solomon, they ruled over all 12 tribes. There was a 13th one, which was the tribe of Levi, who were priests. So they weren't landholders in the way the other 12 were. So they formed a kind of invisible 13th tribe. Now, after the death of King Solomon, the people rebelled in the 10 tribes rebelled against the rule of his successor. Because of the high taxes that were being imposed on them. And they formed their own kingdom in the northern part of what is now Israel, or it's different, there was more land to it at that time than there is now. But they formed their own kingdom of 10 tribes, and that was called Israel. And the southern 2 tribes, which was Judah and Benjamin, along with the priests, the Levites, formed a southern kingdom called Judah. And the Jews were the Judeans, the people of Judah. So they're of the 12 tribes, but they weren't called Israel. Israel was actually the northern kingdom, and its capital was a place called Samaria. And the leading tribe of Israel, the northern tribes, was the tribe of Ephraim. And Ephraim was one of the sons of Joseph. You remember Joseph with a multicolored coat? Well, he had two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, and his father, Joseph's father, Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel, adopted those two sons into his own family. In other words, he made his grandsons as if they were sons because of Joseph and what Joseph had done for the family, saved them. So they get a double portion of the blessings of Israel, one, compared with the other sons. That's a big deal again, all in the book of Genesis. You can read it there, and I'm not going to give you chapter and verse. You should read the story of Jacob and Israel and the prophecies for all the different tribes. Well, those 10 tribes, they formed their own kingdom, and they got steadily more and more into worshipping idolatry. And eventually God had enough of them, and they were carried away by the Assyrians and taken into captivity, and they disappeared from history. So what was left then was the southern kingdom of Judah. The Assyrians carried away quite a lot of the Jews as well, but the southern kingdom, some of it, there was a remnant left, particularly in Jerusalem, and they carried on for a century or more after that, about a century and a half, I think. And they were eventually taken into captivity by the Babylonians. So they went to Babylon, and then later they returned to Jerusalem, and they rebuilt the temple. And you know the history, the Jews in time of Jesus and the Romans, and the Jews we know today. Well, what happened to the other 10 tribes? Well, according to the legends of Britain, they wandered westwards. They escaped from the Assyrian captivity, went westward through the Caucasus Mountains, across the north of the Black Sea, and also through what's now Turkey and into Europe. And they progressed further westwards and ended up, at least some of them, ended up in Britain. And others had already gone there directly by boat at the time of the Assyrian and Babylonian invasions. And they'd brought with them the Stone of Destiny, and also the daughter of the last king of Israel, the last king of Judah, the line of David. And she had married the king of Ireland, who was himself a Hebrew, and they formed a new dynasty in Ireland, and then later that dynasty transferred to Scotland and then to England to become the throne of Great Britain, which allegedly, according to our legends and traditions, is descended from the old line of David. Hence the lions, you see, line of Scotland, lions of England, So we have this whole conflict now between Babylon on the one hand and its future reincarnation as the European Union, and on the other hand the reincarnation of Israel within Britain. Now, I'm not saying that there are other nations in Europe which also are clearly linked to the same peoples, but it's more distinct within Britain, where the throne is and the stone is and the legends are this moated island that is sort of modern Israel. And in 1666, we had the Great Fire of London, and following that, Christopher Wren was put in charge of the rebuilding of London. And actually, I've written a book. I can't see it here at the moment. Oh yes, yeah. I've written a book called The New Jerusalem, about how the image of the New Jerusalem was very much in the forefront of their thinking when they were rebuilding London after the Great Fire. They wanted it to be a New Jerusalem. That's why it was built out of white limestone, a lot of it. And all those churches, and St. Paul's Cathedral in itself is full of references and emblematic geometry relating to Solomon's Temple. I've researched that, and it's all in my book here, The New Jerusalem, which you can get from Amazon and all good bookshops, as they say. Anyway, so this is a part of the mythology of Britain, is the idea that it is the new Israel and that London should be the new Jerusalem. But there's still also a belief that when Jesus comes back, he's going back to original Jerusalem, which incidentally was liberated from the Turks in the First World War by British troops, British and Australian. The Australians are part of the same Israelite connection as the English, the British. Now I want to, England has a kind of second anthem, and I'm going to, there's even been talk about, should we have this as our national anthem? And that is a song or a hymn called Jerusalem. And the first verse goes like this. And did those feet in ancient time walk upon England's mountains green? And was the Holy Lamb of God on England's pleasant pastures seen? And did the countenance divine shine forth upon our clouded hills? And was Jerusalem builded here among those dark satanic mills? So we have this even in our most popular song, and every English person has sung this at some time. It is almost a second anthem, that it relates to a legend we have here that way back when Jesus was a boy, he was brought to Britain by his uncle, Joseph of Arimathea, who was the brother of Mary, his mother. And Joseph was a trader in precious metals. That's why he was rich. He's the one who owned the place where they held the Last Supper. He's the one who had the tomb built, which later became Jesus' tomb, from which he was resurrected. And we have this tradition that he came to Britain, specifically to Cornwall, but he would have gone to other places too. And in Cornwall and Devon is where they used to mine tin. And you need tin to mix with copper to make bronze. And Britain was the place where they had tin in the ancient world, in Europe. They had copper in other places like Cyprus, for instance, but it was unique in having tin. So he would have come there to buy tin, and the legend goes he brought Jesus with him, and they went to Glastonbury, and there Jesus built a wattle hut, which later became the Church of St. Mary, and later a great abbey cathedral. I actually think they've got the location wrong. Yes, Joseph Arimathea did come to Britain. Did he bring his son, his nephew with him? I don't know. But the real connection, I believe, is with South Wales. But that's another story entirely. But we have this idea of that Britain is somehow this holy island, and that Jesus himself came here, and that we're going to build a new Jerusalem here. That is the kind of at the heart of the British English tradition. And you can see it goes right against this whole idea of rebuilding the Roman Empire and rebuilding the Tower of Babel to reach to heaven. And we've got to trick the states of Europe so that they will come and join together to do this enterprise. So they might have many languages, but they'll have one purpose together. That, is a different mythology. And the British mythology is quite at odds with that, if it's true to itself. So the British were placed in a situation where either we had to turn our backs on who we are and say to God, look, forget the Jerusalem stuff, right? We don't believe it. It's not going to happen. We quit. We're atheists now anyway. And I'd have to do that and fit in with the European project, or we have to leave, because what we have here is not to be shared or not to be taken over. The Queen's made her oath to report directly, to that cross on top of her crown. She's not to report to an overlord in Brussels or Geneva or anywhere else. She is sovereign in these islands underneath Jesus Christ. So this is why, when you read the symbols, you begin to understand why Britain had to leave, why it's the first to leave, and I believe other nations will be leaving as well. For example, we have a general belief, not the right word to put, but an understanding that France represents the tribe of Reuben. Britain in particular is linked to the tribe of Ephraim. Hence, we have the throne of Israel. Denmark linked to the tribe of Dan. And you would find that other tribes are linked to other nations in Europe, especially the ones around the North Sea. Those seem to be the main gathering place of the lost tribes of Israel. But I suspect that other countries are going to leave and are going to join us, and there will be a different axis forming, which will be around Britain and the British Commonwealth of Nations and the Union. Well, the trading union between Britain and the United States, and it may well be the United States as Manasseh. If Britain is Ephraim, then the United States, we believe, is Manasseh, and that there will be a union between them again. And that will be a different axis from the axis represented by the European Union. And China, of course, China is another axis, and the China is, of course, closely linked with the symbol of the dragon. And the dragon, as I told you, is Draco, around the controlling the pole of the ecliptic. So we begin to understand our history and what's happening now from the point of view of symbols, and it tells us a story, and it tells us a story of two destinies. One destiny trying to build the Tower of Babel to reach heaven through materialistic means, through material science. And I suppose the epitome of that, although I do love watching what they're doing, is Elon Musk with his spaceships trying to get to Mars. And the other is the dream of Jacob on the pillow stone, which is a spiritual process, and the understanding that we're souls in flesh, and that our souls will ascend to heaven through Jesus Christ and the Christian religion. Now, just before we leave Rome, this is the image of the beast that's given in the book of Revelation, a ravenous beast. And he has 10 horns. I've done other lectures on this, and you can have a look at those. I've done lectures on the book of Daniel in particular, which goes into this. But I believe that he's linked to the signing of the Treaty of Rome, which is the beginning of the EEC, the European Economic Community. And that was done on the Capitoline Hill in Rome, which is where the old Temple of Jupiter used to stand in the pagan period of Rome. And there's now a museum, Museo Capitolini, I think it's called, and in there you'll find the beast, which is this she-wolf feeding Romulus and Remus, the founders of Rome. And Romulus, from whom Rome is named, actually murdered his brother Remus. And the beast that fed them, this wolf, I think is what's meant to be represented as the beast. Daniel had probably never ever seen a wolf. He's living in Babylon, and they didn't have wolves around there. They had lots of other things, but not wolves. So when he sees a wolf, he describes it as being with his strong iron-like teeth and great claws, and it's very fierce. Well, the other thing about wolves is they hunt in packs. And the Romans particularly were the most ferocious warriors of the ancient world, but they hunted in packs. The Roman legions would fight as a unit, and they were the most formidable fighting force of all time in the ancient world, and they conquered everything in their path. So there is this sense of this harking back to the beast by signing this deliberately on the Capitoline Hill, where the statue of Romulus being fed by the wolf is kept. So I think when you look at all these images together, you begin to understand why Britain had to leave the European Union. And as I say, I don't think we'll be the last to leave. I think others will be leaving once they see that we don't die, the sky doesn't fall on our heads like Chicken Little or something. They'll be wanting to leave too, and I would lay odds that Denmark won't be that far behind. We shall see. We shall see. Maybe even France. Who knows? Italy certainly. I think that's odd, isn't it, when you think about Rome and Italy? But I think the Italians also are very fed up with the European Union and the way it's destroying their nation. So there we have it. I don't know what you make of this. You might think Adrian's a complete idiot. He's a fool. It's nothing like that, and forget it. As I say, though, I'm looking at through the process of images and the imagination and the way that images represent and tell a story, because they come from the collective unconscious. If you read Jung, you'll understand all about that. And the images that a nation draws to itself do reflect how it is on a deeper level than the conscious. And the images that the European Union chooses to celebrate, for example, the bull taking Europa, tell one story. And the images of the coronation service and St. George and the Dragon and the Stone of Destiny and the New Jerusalem ideal tell a different story, and they're incompatible. And so I think it was inevitable that come sooner, come later, Britain was going to leave the European Union. Thank you very much. Oh, before I go, if you haven't already, click the little bell and the subscribe button on YouTube. Please do. That way you'll get notified when I put more lectures up. But also I'm trying to get the numbers up. I think we're around about 630 something subscribers. It needs to get up to 1,000 before YouTube will take any notice of this channel and start advertising it and presenting to other people that they might like to have a look at the material here. So if you could help me get up to 1,000, I would be very grateful. I'm giving this work for free, and that's all I ask of you. So thank you very much, and we'll speak again. Goodbye.